Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you're trying to get your head around one of the most vital geopolitical flashpoints in the world, or maybe you're revising for a big history exam, the whole topic of Taiwanese independence can be, well, inherently confusing.
It's genuinely misunderstood, especially, I think, in Western media.
Absolutely. And our mission today is to take a stack of pretty dense sources and just clarify the core of this whole complexity.
We saw a perfect example of that confusion in
hmm
June 2023, when U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in Beijing.
Right.
He repeated the long-standing, very carefully worded U.S. policy. He said America does not support Taiwan's independence.
And the reaction was immediate. Just fire. We saw these prominent figures, from Congressman Jim Banks to the activist Enos Freedom, framing it as everything from weakness to giving China the green light.
Exactly, as if it was some kind of abandonment of Taiwan.
And that reaction, it completely missed the critical, nuanced point. I mean, a point that is absolutely essential if you want to understand modern cross-strait policy.
They were conflating two completely different concepts, these observers, treating them as if they were the same thing.
So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to draw a line in the sand and really clarify the crucial difference between, on the one hand, the specific legal demand for de jure Taiwanese independence.
Which means declaring a brand new state.
Right. And on the other hand, the existing functional reality of Taiwanese autonomy and self-governance.
And our plan is to deliver that clarity. We'll start by tracing the deep historical roots of the independence movement, which go back far longer than many people realize.
Then we'll define those two types of independence.
We'll analyze what the Taiwanese people themselves actually want, which is surprisingly pragmatic. And then finally, we'll unpack the core motivation behind U.S. policy, which is this shrewd strategy that often gets misinterpreted as, weakness or indifference.
Okay, so let's unpack this history, because you just can't understand the modern politics without appreciating where this impulse for self-rule even began. And we have to go back to the period of Japanese occupation, starting in 1895.
That's the real starting block. When the Qing dynasty ceded Taiwan to Japan, the seeds of a separate identity were really sown.
And at first, the movement wasn't necessarily for a separate nation in the modern sense, was it?
No, not at all. It was more about autonomy, about getting distinct representation within the Japanese empire. But the goals sharpened pretty quickly.
And that's when we see the emergence of things like the National People's Movement around 1920.
Right, a civic nationalist effort. They were actively promoting an independent Taiwan, trying to set up a Taiwanese parliament. It was fundamentally about self-determination.
What's also fascinating is the ideological diversity even back then.
Oh, absolutely. By the late 1920s, you had the establishment of the Taiwanese Communist Party, which was arguing for a proletarian state.
And our sources highlight that figures like Mao Zedong actually supported these groups in the 1930s.
He did, but strategically. He saw them as an anti-Japanese force, not necessarily as strict ideological allies. The key point is that the impulse for self-rule was already diverse and deeply rooted long before World War II ever ended.
Which brings us to that monumental post-war shift, the restoration of Taiwan to the Republic of China, the ROC, led by the GMD, the Kuomintang.
And this is where the tension just explodes.
Because the arrival of the mainland GMD administrators and soldiers, it brought immediate cultural clashes, didn't it, and deep resentments.
It did. The whole thing wasn't about a happy reunification. For many locals, it felt like oppression. And that led very quickly to a revolutionary national liberation movement against the ROC's authority.
And then came the true cornerstone event, the trauma that would really define the next 50 years of Taiwanese identity.
The brutal repression that followed the 228 incident in 1947.
That one event.
That day and the weeks of military crackdown that followed, it essentially became the defining tragedy, the unifying myth of the independence movement, the sheer scale of the violence, the targeting of the local elite.
It just cemented in the minds of so many people that the ROC government, the incoming mainlanders, were occupiers.
Just as much as the Japanese had been.
Exactly. And so after the 228 incident, the goal shifts. It moves from just resisting the ROC to establishing a clear, separate Taiwanese identity to, legitimize the struggle.
Right, which meant promoting the use of the Taiwanese language over the Mandarin being taught in schools, and critically organizing abroad where the ROC government couldn't reach them.
These efforts abroad are so important to the story.
They're critical. In 1948, you have the Liao brothers, Thomas and Joshua, who had escaped the crackdown. They set up the Alliance for the Reliberation of Taiwan in Japan.
It grew from there.
It did. By the 1950s, they had formed a Republic of Taiwan provisional government, also in Japan, and they were even forging these nominal links to Sukarno's government in Indonesia. They were trying to internationalize the cause.
Now, here's the crucial legal fulcrum that still matters so much today. The Treaty of San Francisco in 1951.
This is where history hands the independence movement its most powerful legal platform. In that treaty, Japan formally renounced all rights, title, and claim to Taiwan. But, and this is the critical part, it failed to specify a successor state.
So, the argument goes.
The argument is simple but very effective. If Japan gave up sovereignty, and neither the ROC nor the PRC were named as the recipients, then the sovereignty of Taiwan has to be decided by the Taiwanese people themselves.
Through self-determination.
Exactly. That legal ambiguity is still leveraged by independence advocates to this day.
And yet, for decades, none of this could be openly debated, right? The ROC was under martial law until 1987.
Strict control. Any discussion of independence was absolutely forbidden, which of course just fueled the pro-democracy movement that eventually gave rise to the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP.
Okay, so we've established this deep historical desire for self-determination. Now let's solve the Blinken puzzle, because this distinction between de jure and de facto is really the key piece of history revision you need to retain here.
Let's do it.
So let's revisit that confusion. Why did so many people, even informed observers, call the U.S. statement weakness or giving China the green light?
Because they failed to distinguish between the two separate meanings of the word independence.
Okay, so let's start with the one the U.S. formally opposes, the dangerous one.
That would be de jure Taiwanese independence. This is the specific, formal, legal proposal.
What does it entail?
It means rejecting the authority of the current state, the Republic of China, the ROC, and legally establishing a brand new state.
Called the Republic of Taiwan.
Exactly. A new constitution getting rid of the ROC flag, its institutions, a formal declaration of statehood to the world. It was famously part of the DPP's original 1991 party charter.
And that specific pursuit is the red line.
That is the red line. The formal constitutional creation of a new sovereign entity. It's what the U.S. opposes because it's the one unilateral action that carries the highest, most immediate risk of provoking a conflict with Beijing.
So what's the alternative? The other kind of independence?
That's what we could call lowercase independence, or just status quo autonomy and self-governance.
So this embraces the existing state.
It embraces it completely. The argument here is we are already independent. We are the Republic of China. We have our own elected government, our own military, our own currency. We function as an independent state.
And this is the critical insight for you, the listener. The difference here determines everything.
It does. When the U.S. says it does not support independence, it means it opposes that de jure constitutional change, the unilateral declaration.
It is absolutely not denouncing Taiwan's current functional autonomy.
Or its democracy, or its way of life under the ROC framework. I mean, think about it.
Right. If the U.S. actually supported unification with Beijing, they wouldn't be selling billions of dollars in advanced weaponry to the ROC government.
Of course not. They are simply opposing the constitutional act that would serve as Beijing's most direct pretext for an invasion.
So the policy is aimed at preventing conflict over what is essentially a name change, not denouncing the reality of self-governance.
That's the heart of the matter.
Okay, that brings us to Section 3. So what does the political reality actually look like on the ground? Given that whole history, does the Taiwanese electorate even want this risky de jure independence that the U.S. opposes so strongly?
The answer, and you have to really study the data here, is a very pragmatic no.
And we can see this going back to the 1990s.
We can. The DPP's initial explicitly pro-independence agenda was an electoral failure. They just could not crack 30% of legislative seats.
Which forced a major reckoning among the DPP strategists.
It did. They correctly concluded that immediate constitutional de jure independence was, and I'm quoting here, electoral poison. It was a profound political risk the voters just were not willing to take.
And this led to a monumental political pivot in 1999, arguably one of the most important documents in modern Taiwanese political history.
Yes, the pragmatic resolution on Taiwan's future.
So let's detail that shift. This resolution, it fundamentally superseded the party's original independence clause. What did it say that made it such a palatable compromise for voters?
It was brilliant, really, because it managed to satisfy the nationalist desire without creating all that risk.
How so?
The resolution stated that Taiwan is already a sovereign, independent state and that its official name is a Republic of China.
Ah, so it just neutralized the entire debate over a declaration.
Completely. It meant the DPP could now campaign by saying, look, we are already independent, so why on earth should we risk a war for a name change?
And that pragmatic shift, that's what delivered the DPP's big triumph in the 2000 election.
It is, and it's why the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, and the likely 2024 frontrunner, William Lai, now consistently insist that Taiwan has no need to declare independence.
Because it's functionally independent already under the ROC framework. They're just governing within the status quo.
And the public opinion data from National Tsinghua University just confirms this pragmatism over and over. I mean, it is genuinely surprising when you look at the long-term trends.
Okay, so let's look at the numbers. What about support for independence as soon as possible? That du jour path.
It has remained strikingly low for 30 years. It actually peaked back in 2007 at just 7.8%. Today, in 2023, it sits at a meager 4.6%.
Wow. That shows incredible political maturity from the electorate.
Absolutely does. A vast majority of Taiwanese, consistently over 60%, are content to simply maintain Taiwan's current status quo for the foreseeable future. They are not rushing to change the name or the constitution.
Because they have a functional democracy and a highly successful economy.
Exactly. Why risk it? But there is a nuanced growth in the middle ground, which tells us something really important about identity.
And that's the option too.
The option to maintain the status quo and move toward independence, that has more than doubled since the year 2000. It peaked at 25.5% right after the 2020 Hong Kong crackdown.
So that option is the sweet spot.
It really is. It represents a strong, growing national consciousness, people identifying as distinctly Taiwanese, but it's a patient one. They're just unwilling to risk their enormous gains for a formal legal declaration that would trigger a war. They are highly practical risk assessors.
And that deep political pragmatism in Taipei is what makes the final piece of this puzzle, the U.S. policy, so effective.
It is, and we really need to understand the core motivation for Washington's position here. It is to deter Beijing's use of force and to provide a stabilizing floor for China-U.S. relations.
Right, this is where we shift from history to pure strategy. And when we analyze this policy, it helps to use Thomas Schelling's concept from arms and influence.
It's the perfect lens.
For deterrence to work, you don't just need credible threats, you also need credible assurances, right?
Schelling's model is perfect here. Washington's credible military threat, the possibility of intervening if Beijing attacks, is what deters an invasion. But the necessary assurance to Beijing is the explicit commitment not to support Taiwan crossing that red line.
So the U.S. opposition to de jure independence is the most indispensable political assurance Washington can possibly make to China.
It is. And that assurance works because, as the sources show, China's leadership dreads Taiwanese independence above almost any other outcome. They see it as a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party itself.
And they even codified this dread into law.
They did. Beijing passed the National Anti-Secession Law specifically to create a legal pretext, a casus belli, to use force if independence forces ever tried to make unification formally impossible.
And Washington has been very clear about enforcing its side of this bargain. There's a prime historical example from 2004.
Right, when then-President George W. Bush firmly and publicly rebuked the incumbent Taiwanese president, Chen Shui-bian, for even talking about an independence referendum.
And that public rebuke, our sources tell us, earned a high appreciation of the Chinese leader at the time, Hu Jintao.
It did. It showed Beijing that Washington was serious about the assurance part of the policy, not just the deterrence part.
And this is the essence of that tightrope walk. China places a far higher value on stopping independence than Taiwan currently places on pursuing it immediately.
Right. And that strategic imbalance means that the U.S. opposition to de jure independence is a comforting baseline assurance to Beijing,
while remaining a totally acceptable, pragmatic arrangement for Taipei's leaders.
In short, the policy places the U.S. in a very strong diplomatic position. It is not abandonment. It's a shrewd, critical strategy designed for stability, and it's largely agreeable to all partners because it prioritizes the status quo of autonomy over a risky legal confrontation.
Okay, let's quickly synthesize our key takeaways from this deep dive. First, the independence movement has these deep historical roots going all the way back to 1895, forged by trauma like the 228 incident.
But immediate de jure independence declaring a new Republic of Taiwan is politically unpopular and, frankly, electorally risky.
Second, the functional status quo, where Taiwan is already self-governing under the ROC framework, is overwhelmingly preferred by the Taiwanese people.
Who have very wisely prioritized stability, democracy, and economic development over some kind of constitutional confrontation.
And third, U.S. opposition to de jure independence is that critical stabilizing factor. It's an indispensable political assurance to China, a core part of its deterrent strategy.
And it should never, ever be mistaken for a denunciation of Taiwan's functional autonomy or its democracy.
Looking forward, we have to acknowledge the immediate friction, though. The CCP is already preparing to demonize William Lai, the likely 2024 presidential winner, as a radical independent separatist.
Despite his very pragmatic embrace of the ROC status quo, and should the U.S. again publicly oppose independence, maybe as a diplomatic balm for poor relations observers, must remember the critical distinction we've made today.
And not conflate that statement with a denunciation of Taiwan's autonomy or its way of life. Thank you for sharing your sources and letting us dive into this complex and vital topic. As we wrap up, consider this final question. Given the rise of this distinct, patient Taiwanese national identity and the overwhelming preference for the status quo, how many more decades can the existing ROC framework realistically contain that identity before political pressure from within Taiwan forces a major change? We'll leave you to explore that thought.